you can't inflict this technology, which by your own account is going to upend people's lives, change the way you think about being human because there's a rival form of machine cognition, change the way you raise your children, change the way your job will work. You can't do that to people unless you explain why you're doing it and what motivates you and who you are and what your values are. And so I'm saying you need a book, and I'm keen to do it.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. And today, our guest is Sebastian Mallaby, an author and journalist currently serving as the Paul A. Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's one of the leading chroniclers of global finance, modern capitalism, and elite decision-making. His books explore how markets really work, not in theory, but through the people, institutions, and feedback loops that drive them. His most recent book, The Infinity Machine, tells the remarkable story of Demis Hassabis and the rise of DeepMind, chronicling the pursuit of artificial general intelligence that we go use AGI now to denominate. But we're delighted to welcome you, Sebastian, to our podcast, and thank you for coming in to talk about your new book.
Of course. It's great to be here.
So you have written about some of the titans of finance. You've written about Alan Greenspan, Jim Wolfenson. You've written about some of the major groups that have propelled modern-day capitalism into a new kind of future, from hedge funds and other kinds of funds, including Renaissance. Jim Simons was a member of our board for many years, to your most recent book before this about venture capital, or venture capitalists, I should say. In a way, it's a natural progression that you would go from that book to writing about one of the key figures in the rise of modern artificial intelligence. But in another way, this book takes you into a new kind of terrain. And partly that terrain is a terrain that we think a lot about at the New York Academy of Sciences, because it is indeed the terrain of science. And of all the movers and shakers, and there are movers and shakers in the field of AI, as we all know, Demis is perhaps the most scientifically minded, and you cover in really great detail and also with, I think, extraordinary sense of the kinds of scientific issues at stake, what indeed the science kinds of issues and questions that have motivated Demis for much of his career really are. But I'd like just to begin to ask you, and then I'm going to go back and ask you to talk about the book more generally. What were some of the challenges you had shifting into thinking about, somebody who wants to be like Einstein and establish the next level of relativity theory and the like? And what kinds of challenges did you find most difficult and challenging?
Well, you're exactly right that there was kind of a hyphen between my finance books and this science book, in the sense that venture capital is both. It's the financing of science or applied science. But nonetheless, you're also right that there was quite a significant hill to climb intellectually to get my head around AI, to understand enough about it to kind of shape a story about it, to communicate it to the general reader, whilst not offending the specialist. But I kind of like that challenge. I mean, the joy of writing books is that, each one takes me a long time, 4 or 5 years. But after the 4 or 5 years, I pivot into something different. And I'm always more attracted by the novel challenge than by repeating what I've done before.
Now, you also alternate between the more biographical mode and the kind of collective or prosopography mode of writing about a particular phenomenon. And the Power Law, of course, had a lot of characters in it, including some of the people who reappear in this book. But did you deliberately set out to write a biography when you thought about AI, or did you really happen upon it because of the particular interest that you developed in the life and work of Demis?
I mean, I think with each project, there's some combination of finding a topic which you think is cuspy, it's going to break out, it's exciting, it matters for how the world works, and then finding the way to tell the story. And the latter, as you say, sometimes it's a biography of one person. And that was true of my book, especially of Alan Greenspan, where I did a full length, maybe too long perhaps, biography of somebody who was at the center of public life for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And then other times you don't find exactly the one person, but you have a series of characters, and you're riding a different horse with each chapter. And with Demis and DeepMind and AI, it was always clear to me that the most attractive way to write the story would be to focus on Demis, that he was the person whose intellectual life story could be mapped onto the making of modern AI, mm-hmm. and more fascinating in a way than bringing in lots of characters. If you've got one very, very good central character, you can have others that illuminate him by playing off him, by being rivals, by being friends, competitors, collaborators, all that stuff. That's fine. But to have one strong central character is an advantage if you can find somebody who's strong enough. And in this case, I did.
So just let's back up a little bit. Well, first of all, when you were doing the Power Law, did you meet Demis at that time?
I did. And that was an advantage. I used to go to tech conferences, and he would show up sometimes at the European ones, and there would be this sort of kind of approachable, disarmingly boyish figure with his hair falling down to his eyes. And, you'd sort of think nothing of him. He's slight in stature and modest in manner. And then he would get on the stage, and the ideas would simply tumble out from computer science to neuroscience to philosophy to physics to the meaning of life. I mean, it was intoxicating. And so the kind of contrast between his, I'll wash the dishes after lunch, kind of approachable next-door neighbor kind of demeanor, and that intellectual reach was always intriguing.
So you decide to focus on Demis, and tell me a little bit about how you started the project and what you thought you were going to accomplish in writing this, and perhaps what you've reconsidered over the course of the multi-year both research and writing of the book.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing was to get his collaboration, to get his willingness to spend many hours of his life with me.
And you said you spent 30 plus hours sitting in the upstairs of a pub
exactly.
in
London. And that's a non-trivial ask when you're talking to somebody that busy. So I actually spent probably 3 months reading about AI history and reading his lectures and listening to podcasts that he'd done, trying to get my head into his head, so that when I went to meet him and pitch him on this, I'd met him in passing before, as I said, but when I went and made the ask, I wanted it to be as persuasive as possible, because this wasn't going to be easy. And so I went in and I said, look, you're saying in all your speeches the same thing, which is that AI will be the most important discovery in the history of humanity. If that's the case, Demis, you will be one of the most important people in the history of humanity. And if that's the case, Demis, you have a choice here. I mean, there will be books about you. So first of all, let's just establish that. And secondly, you should want there to be a good book about you, because you can't inflict this technology, which by your own account is going to upend people's lives, change the way you think about being human because there's a rival form of machine cognition, change the way you raise your children, change the way your job will work. You can't do that to people unless you explain why you're doing it and what motivates you and who you are and what your values are. And so I'm saying you need a book, and I'm keen to do it. And that pitch worked. And then by total coincidence, I thought that AI was fascinating but a bit niche. But I pitched Demis in November 2022, and on November the 30th, of course, ChatGPT came out.
So you pitched him before that?
I pitched him before ChatGPT, but my subject went from the niche fringe to the mainstream much faster than I thought.
Yes, no, we all, of course, you tell this wonderful long durée story of the development of the LLM, the release of earlier versions of GPT by OpenAI. not to mention the earlier history to that even of some of the kinds of major accomplishments of DeepMind. But it is true that until late November 30th of 2022, AI wasn't tripping off everybody's lips the way it has really almost continuously since then. So this was a prescient move on your part. But of course, I'm very glad that you persuaded Demis to spend the time with you to allow you to write this kind of book. But let's back up and talk a little bit about his earlier life. I am like you. I'm not a scientist by background. I run an Academy of Sciences, but in the case of AI, I often have to abandon any kind of modesty or prudence and both read about it and then talk about some of the most extraordinary scientific and engineering challenges that we face. And so it turns out that a whole generation now is learning things about AI that feels very new and sometimes plunges us into depths that we're probably should not go, certainly with our lack of preparation. But in the course of this book and your journey to understand him, you cover a lot of ground. And you begin with Demis as a young child chess prodigy.
Right.
George Steiner, the literary critic, wrote a famous piece in The New Yorker years and years and years ago about the fact that there were three areas where you have child prodigies: music, math, and chess. And Demis, certainly had the chess, and he seems to have the math. Mm-hmm. Maybe not the music, I don't know. But what Steiner goes on to say is that many of the people who are, these kinds of gifted savants when they're young sputter out mm-hmm. and aren't able to really take the gifts that they have and either, have the kind of psychic resilience to convert that into a lifetime career or, lose interest or move in some other direction. And here we have a case of somebody who, obviously not only didn't give up, but he never stopped growing and developing new kind of ambition. And his ambition is indeed pretty staggering when you see some of the kinds of statements that you record him having made. But tell us a little bit. Your book has just recently come out, so I think many of the listeners to the podcast won't have yet had a chance to read this fabulous book. And I hope they will go out and buy it and read it soon. But go back a little bit in Demis's life and tell us about how a combination of chess and games led to DeepMind.
Yeah. So as you say, he was a child prodigy with chess, meaning that he climbed up on a chair, apparently, to watch his father playing against his uncle. And just by looking at the board and watching the grown-ups play, he understood the game pretty fast. In a few weeks, he could defeat an adult. And by 6, he was playing in tournaments against much older children. And by about 10, 11, 12, he was the best youth chess player in Britain and the second best in the world. So he really played at quite a high level. And he was, it was a competitive world. So there apparently were wooden boards underneath the tables of the chess tournaments so that the kids wouldn't kick each other in the leg when the other one was trying to concentrate.
Yes. And
there are a lot of people burning out, bursting into tears. It's just sort of, it was a stressful, high-stakes thing. Demis told me about instances where his father, who was kind of a bohemian traveling toy seller, sold toys out of the back of a family camper van, where his father would yell at him and say, how could you be so foolish as to lose that game? What were you thinking? And Demis eventually said, well, I wasn't trying to lose, so what are you talking about? But there was a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. And he seems to have thrived on that pressure and to have made it his personal creed to give, more than 100%, if that's possible, on all occasions. My early interviews included one with Shane Legg, a co-founder of DeepMind. And Shane said to me the most distinctive thing about partnering with Demis and founding DeepMind was that you were shackling yourself to somebody who didn't understand the meaning of 50% effort or even 90% effort. It was always more than 100%. And there was a story about how Demis' father one day had said to him, well, you have to try your best. And I've said that to my son. And what I mean is, if you lose the game, it's fine, so long as you tried your best. Demis interpreted this in a different way. It was, you have to try your absolute best, absolute best. And I said to him one day, what did that mean, absolute best? He said, well, if you're running a race and you don't fall across the finish tape and get taken to hospital for resuscitation, you obviously had more energy, which you could have expended. So you didn't try your best. That's how he comes at life. So anyway, he's forged in this fire of competitive chess. And then around about 14, 15, he plays a game against an adult opponent, which kind of drags on for the whole day, and it has a very excruciatingly exhausting endgame. And finally he loses. And he's torn between revulsion at his loss and revulsion at the whole idea of the tournament. Because, you know, as he said later, he thought that all the people in that tournament hall, expending every ounce of their energy on moving pieces across a 64 square board, it was a waste of our collective mental energy. And so he pivoted a bit from chess to coding. Coding chess games was a sort of segue for him. And he ended up writing the code and doing the design for a very successful video game called Theme Park. And around the time he was 17 or so, he completed this, and it sold 5 million copies. And just to round off this story, he was offered more than $1 million in today's money by the boss of the video game design company to turn down the position he had won at Cambridge University to read computer science. And he preferred to go do the computer science than to take the $1 million. So,
and he did not grow up with a lot of money.
No, that's right. His parents,
this was a particularly meaningful offer, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah. But that was the first moment where you really see him prioritizing knowledge over riches.
Now, you know, one of the subtexts of the book is the contrast between London and the Silicon Valley. And I think there are lots of stories of people who were persuaded either by the possibility of that kind of payout or certainly by an ambition to make money of that kind to drop out of the Harvards and Stanfords and so on and so forth of the world and try their hand at being an entrepreneur. But here you have a contrast, you know, that begins a whole sequence of contrasts between these two milieus. So he goes to Cambridge.
Mm-hmm. He goes to Cambridge, that's right.
And he studies computer science?
He studies computer science.
But he has a very broad set of interests.
Yeah, I mean, he's always a magpie. He always likes to collect knowledge from everyone. The most sort of long-term important example of this was that a friend of his was a biologist, and apparently when they were in the bar or playing table football or something, the friend mentioned the grand challenge laid down by the Nobel laureate Christian and Finsen, who conjectured that the DNA sequence on an amino acid strand predicted the shape of the protein into which it folded. And Demis kind of stored this in the back of his mind. Mm-hmm. Wasn't germane to computer science right then, but of course much later it became germane to computer science. But he collected ideas from everywhere, and he interpreted computer science in a pretty ambitious and broad way. You know, he was not happy just to be studying symbolic logic, and he wanted to think about how you could build machines that were much more ambitious than that. He'd read Gödel, Escher, Bach as
Hofstadter's book.
Yeah, exactly. And before university, he'd read that, and it made a big impression, and particularly the idea that what the human brain can do, a computer should be able to do one day, that the brain is really a system of information with electrical signals denoting ones and zeros like the ones and zeros in a computer. So there was no theoretical reason why you couldn't push it all the way. And if you were going to push it all the way, clearly first-order logic was not enough, because we don't speak in first-order logic. We adopt categories which are not really logical. They're a bit arbitrary. in many ways, our thinking is inductive, not deductive. And so he knew that what he was learning in computer science was a small share of what he wanted to learn. So he always had that ambition.
So in the world of AI, there are people who did their studies in computer science to the extent that they did, and others who come out of neuroscience. Demis started with computer science and then goes on to do a degree in neuroscience. Just tell me a little bit more about how he negotiated different kinds of fields. He obviously didn't have any background in neuroscience. You don't usually just do a PhD or a advanced degree in a field that you don't have any kind of prior training in.
He's an amazingly persuasive character. So, after his undergraduate degree, he did something totally countercultural for London, which was to found a company. And the company tried to build video games, and it was sort of a mixed story. It didn't really succeed. And to recover, in inverted commas, from this and do something more, relaxing, he thought a neuroscience PhD would be just the thing. And he talked his way into University College London by persuading the person who would be his supervisor that his computational skills would be valuable to the team. And she said, she was called Eleanor Maguire, and she said to him, well, okay, but you have to read your way into the subject before you show up. And so Demis got married at that point and went on a honeymoon in Italy with a stack of papers on memory and imagination. And reading these on the beach in Italy, he came up with the idea for his first paper, which, sure enough, he eventually wrote. And that was one of the most cited papers of that period in neuroscience.
Well, leaving aside the forbearance of his new wife, I assume he's still married. And
they're still married. She's an academic biologist. I think she's a biologist. She's a scientist.
Yeah. So she
understood.
She understood what he was doing. All right. So he goes on. He does this PhD, but he doesn't lose interest in gaming. Right?
Correct.
I mean, this is a kind of story that is going on all the way through his career. So he, how does he kind of move back and forth? And then, tell us how he decides to start looking at artificial intelligence as a project.
Well, the reason to go and study neuroscience was to understand the existence proof for intelligence. And the point was always to come out of that and build an artificial analog. And so it wasn't a digression from the path, it was a continuation of his ambition. And the moment he finished the neuroscience PhD, he did a postdoc at a place called the Gatsby Unit, which is attached to University College London. And the point of that was that the Gatsby Unit combines people from neuroscience, computational neuroscience, and then people from computer science. It's a deliberately sort of, cross-disciplinary center. And he thought that would be the place to meet like-minded people who wanted to build really powerful AI, who are very ambitious about repeating the magic of human cognition, but in silico. And he met there Shane Legg, who was a computer scientist from New Zealand who'd done a PhD in Switzerland in computer science, defining artificial general intelligence, what that would mean, how you would measure it, how likely was it. And Shane Legg had reached the same conclusion as Demis, which is that, superhuman intelligence was going to be possible, but he'd arrived at it in a far more rigorous mathematical, academic way. Demis's formation was Gödel, Escher, Bach, as I said, but also a bunch of science fiction, and essentially a kind of dissatisfaction with the limits of Cambridge undergraduate computer science and feeling there was something more. And then neuroscience, which kind of showed him how to understand human intelligence. Shane Legg, on the other hand, had done mathematics at university in undergraduate and masters, and then did computer science. It was a more algorithmic, sort of straight path towards AI. And the two of them bonded, and they recognized they could contribute different parts of the puzzle. And the other thing about Shane Legg is that he had an entree into the American world of, were they AI scientists or were they at that point just AI dreamers? I mean, they were on the cusp between sort of visionaries and crazies. And they had this thing called the Singularity Summit. There were people like Ray Kurzweil who were involved in this. Peter Thiel was a sponsor of it. And that was very important because through Shane Legg's connections in that community, Demis and he went off to San Francisco to a conference in 2010, met Peter Thiel, and began the process of talking money out of him so that they could found their company DeepMind, which duly was founded at the end of 2010.
So we'll come back to Peter Thiel and the extent to which he was an early supporter and then not so much. And indeed, there's a whole set of questions I have about that. And I know Peter Thiel was also part of the power law. And he was, going back to the days when he was part of the PayPal mafia. But late 2010 is an interesting year for this. It's also, by most accounts, the year before Jeff Hinton and his colleagues in Toronto began with a number of graduate students to really begin to realize the potential of neural networks. Something that, goes way back to Marvin Minsky and MIT, but had been going through its own form of AI winter for really quite a number of years. So Demis and Shane established, do they call it DeepMind from the start?
They do, yeah.
And they get a little bit of initial funding, and then they go back to London, where their base is, and somewhere around Russell Square, if I remember correctly. But do they notice that neural networks are beginning to at least cause ripples in the larger field of artificial intelligence? I want to come later to the story of how but not only Demis, but also characters like David Silver play a very big role in really plumbing the potential of reinforcement learning, but in contrast to, and sometimes in actual opposition to using the kinds of things that came out of neural networks and transformers and language models, and ultimately what went into the creation of ChatGPT. But what was the kind of ecosystem like in 2011, 2012, 2013? Because all the retrospective histories go back to that as the kind of moment when LLMs really begin to become possible.
Yeah. Well, Demis was very much aware of the breakout potential of deep learning and neural networks. He had met Jeff Hinton because Demis did a postdoc at MIT and at Harvard simultaneously. I wrote that, and then somebody said, that can't be possible. Surely that's impossible. So I actually emailed Tommaso Poggio, the MIT supervisor, for confirmation. And he said, yes, no, he was enrolled in both postdocs at once, and he would shuttle between the two.
I see.
And he, in this stint, when he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he did meet Jeff Hinton, who was visiting from Toronto. And so he knew Hinton, he knew all about the potential of neural networks. But he's a magpie, as I said earlier, and so his ambition was always to kind of be inclusive intellectually, and he wanted to combine neural networks with other approaches. And one of these was reinforcement learning, but it was actually not limited to that. He was open to lots of things we've now forgotten. And it was all kind of bound together with this faith that, having studied neuroscience, it gave him an edge, because he had seen how different parts of the human brain, the hippocampus, the neocortex, and so forth, do different functions. And it's the combination of these different bits of intelligence that produces real intelligence. And he really stressed, there's a document he wrote at the time when he was raising money for DeepMind, the kind of business plan, which after much negotiation, I finally got him to hand over. I don't know why he was so reluctant, because it's a historical artifact. There's nothing proprietary anymore. But anyway, I read this document, and it's full of predictions that by 2030 we would have superintelligence, which turns out to be about right. And that you
should have wanted to give this to you from the beginning.
Yeah. And that you would get there through combining these different approaches to intelligence. So there was always a kind of melting pot philosophy. Whereas, as you're saying, outside of DeepMind, the thing that was working was neural nets, deep learning, and the pure version of that. And so the ImageNet breakthrough, where Hinton and his students produced what's known as the CATS paper, and this was end of 2012, which finally, could recognize a cat. This was pure deep learning with no other kind of polluting additive.
So that was pure deep learning,
right?
At the time.
Yeah, and kind of simultaneous to 2012 is when DeepMind, in contrast, was combining deep learning with reinforcement learning to produce what became the Atari system, which they called DQN. And this was a system they trained to play the old Atari games from 1970s, 80s, 90s, games like Pong and Sequest and Breakout. And they trained an agent to play against the computer and to play at a superhuman level against the computer, and to devise the strategies. All these different games have different tricks that players use to do well at them. And just through trial and error, the AI discovered for itself all these tricks that humans know, and then a few extras. And building that system was a feat of fusion between, you needed the deep learning to just look at the pixels on the screen and recognize the images. And then you needed reinforcement learning, which is really about trial and error, where you had an agent that tried a random move. Let's say in Pong, it moves the paddle up or down. If it hits the ball, it gets 1 point. If it misses, it gets 0. That's a feedback signal from the environment, which is teaching it whether the move it just did was good or bad. And by aggregating lots and lots and lots of moves with the result of those moves, and then doing more deep learning on top of those data, DeepMind built this system that mastered all these different games.
So, there is obviously a strong connection between these games and gaming and the development of AI and advanced machine learning. As somebody who never played video games, I find this all a little bit mysterious and also counterintuitive. But, obviously people like Demis were doing this back and forth all the time. Could you just say a little bit about how he putting aside just the fun of playing a game, and apparently he likes to play and he likes to win, whether it's, paddle football or whatever it might be. But a little bit about why games are so useful for the development of AI systems.
Sure. Well, if the ultimate goal is to build an intelligence that can navigate the world like a human can, you're going to have a system that acts in the world, observes the reaction of the world to the environment to it, and learns through trial and error. Humans do this all the time. We understand the physical environment because we act in it, and we pick up a cup. If we drop it, if it's made of glass, it might break, and the water is liquid, so it spills on the carpet. And you learn through action, not just by going to the library and reading. And you can think of deep learning, where you ingest a lot of data, as going to the library and reading. And that's great, but it's not enough for full intelligence. Now the question is, on the way to building this trial and error embodied intelligence, which is incredibly complicated to build because the natural environment is so irregular and complex to navigate, you need to put a baby agent in a artificial world where it can try out trial and error, but in a much simpler environment. And so the simplest of all would be something like Pong, where you just have one paddle and you move it up or down or keep it still. And those three choices, super simple, right? And having mastered that very simple environment, you can move on to something more complex like the game of Go, which...
Well, Go is significantly more complicated.
Okay, so maybe I should say move on to more complex Atari games and then later go.
And then eventually you get to the game of games, which is Go.
Yeah.
And of course, the
Are
story
you a Go
of,
player by any chance? You sound rather affectionate about Go.
No, I have played, but I won't say that I'm a player at all. But with the different documentaries that have come out, the Thinking Game, and so on and so forth, the kind of drama of the victory of AlphaGo over Lee Sedol is now, I think, pretty widely recognized as a kind of major breakpoint in terms of the development of AI. In 2016, 2017, I was in Berkeley, and one of the people that I interacted with there was Eric Schmidt, and he came in the end of 2016, and he said everything has changed. For him, that was a much more important breakthrough. That is to say, the Go victory of AlphaGo than the recognition that a cat was a cat back in 2012. And of course, there were two moments, and one less dramatic perhaps, but in some ways perhaps more important, that came after the first victory, which was the move effectively from taking all the information that could be downloaded about past Go games for the DeepMind AlphaGo computer to work with, to actually just learning on its own with the rules and then just playing itself. Could you just say a little bit about that moment, that transition, and what and how that really was a kind of breakthrough moment for not only Demis, but for our understanding of what AI can do?
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful to think again about that difference between going to the library and reading and then going out in the real world and experiencing stuff. Let's suppose that you want to understand something, but actually there's only 2 books in the library that relate to it. And once you've read those, you want to understand some more. You need to get your own data. So now you would go out in the real world, and whatever the subject was, you would perhaps do some experiments in that field, or you would seek out individuals, whatever you're doing. You're out of the library now. And in the same way with Go, you could train the system on all the annotated human expert games, which could get you quite a long way, but not to be better than those experts who played those games, right? And so what do you do next? You need some new source of information, of data, or something to learn from. And so DeepMind set up its Go system to play against itself. And by playing against itself, it was generating new data on which it could then train. And so it's this transition from dependence on existing data. And remember that at least at this period in the history of AI, all of the data that you trained on for image recognition or for anything else had to be painstakingly labeled. The system couldn't learn unless the picture of a cat was labeled cat. And annotation is time-consuming and difficult and so forth. And so that's another reason why, DeepMind could have said, okay, we've trained our system on all the annotated human games. Now we're going to hire 1,000 human Go players and lock them up in a tournament hall, and they're going to play for 6 months, and then we'll have a lot more data, and then we can do some more training. But that would be very expensive. Much better to have the system generate its own data. And I frame it this way because this question of where do you get data from is key to understanding why later the Transformer paper is so exciting and important. Because with the Transformer paper in 2017, what it enabled you to do, and it was not just the transport, but kind of a set of changes around that time, 2016, 2017, you went from supervised learning in deep learning, where all the data had to be annotated, to self-supervised learning, where the system sort of did the annotation itself. So rather than humans labeling data, the computer would get a sentence in English and cover up the last word, and then test itself on its ability to predict the last word. And effectively, it had created its own data set to train on. And this obsoleted one of the big advantages of reinforcement learning, which was it was a way of getting extra data. Once you could download all of the internet, and you didn't have to label anything, then the advantage of reinforcement learning was diminished.
Well, you write in the book that you had a conversation with Demis, who basically said there were 2 lucky breaks for these major revolutions, the industrial and the digital. The first, that there were these vast deposits of coal and oil that allowed the industrial revolution once the machine machines were developed to take off because the fuel was there. And by the same, in the same sense, the internet was a kind of trove of fuel for the development of advanced AI. But tell us a little bit more about the kind of developing debate between 2017 and really up to the, say, 22, 23, when DeepMind has to respond to ChatGPT, between those who are stressing reinforcement learning, self-learning structures and systems, and those who are just wanting to use the vast new power of compute and the endless amount of data available on the internet to power the first LLMs.
Yeah. I mean, the fascinating thing I think about this story is the way you've got within artificial intelligence these main schools by this point, deep learning and reinforcement learning. And at different times in the story, one of them is making the progress, and the other one is slightly playing, support partner. And then it flips. And so, you could think about the beginning of the story, 2012, you've got the ImageNet triumph for deep learning, but you've also got the Atari agent, which is a triumph for reinforcement learning. And then a bit later, reinforcement learning seems to dominate because that's what's really driving the success of that Go system in 2016. Then there's another one called AlphaZero in 2017, which is even stronger. And so for a while, it looks like reinforcement learning is driving everything. But of course, in that year, 2017, is when the Transformer paper came out. And that plus sort of self-supervised learning put the deep learners in a position where they had new tools. And so what happens between 2017 and kind of 2023-ish is that reinforcement learning became much less important because this pure deep learning empowered with the transformer model, empowered with the ability for the systems to kind of label their own data for themselves, empowered, by the way, with stronger semiconductors, and the discovery of this trove of, you could just download the whole internet and you had almost unlimited data. It wasn't like cat pictures. It was the whole of the language. All of a sudden, the game changed. And this enabled, in a way which was clear probably only in retrospect, the pure deep learning school to shoot ahead. So if you looked at, GPT in 2018, the first model from OpenAI, or GPT-2 or GPT-3 or even ChatGPT, these are all models that only use a tiny amount of reinforcement learning called reinforcement learning from human feedback, where it's humans giving the feedback. It's not proper machine reinforcement learning. And so DeepMind, having bet on reinforcement learning as its sort of special source, fell behind in this part of the story.
So then, let's move up to the present because, of course, OpenAI has this extraordinary moment when it releases ChatGPT, and it's all anybody can talk about. It's all anybody can use. And, of course, there's panic over in Google, in the Googleplex. And I happen to know some people who lost their jobs because Google decided to put all of their resources towards AI as a result of that. But then what happens in relationship to both deep learning and reinforcement learning and the way in which DeepMind is playing a role that then, of course, when conjoined with Google Brain, becomes the dispositive role that Google is playing in this space to catch up?
Well, deep learning had this golden period for a bit. And then around about, I guess, 2024, it was noticed that the systems were very good at composing language, quite good at things like limericks and the manipulation of, storytelling and all that, but less good at logic, not good at math. In fact, very bad at math. And reasoning sort of step by step is not what these systems did. What they did was, if you said, what's 3 plus 4, they would look in their data set and try to find some piece of text which had 3 + 4 = 7. So they would get that right because it's very simple. But then if you said, what is 35 times 79? That might not be in the data set, and they would hallucinate some nonsense. So you actually needed to teach them to think step by step. And that turned out to be a problem that you taught through reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning made a comeback. And what happened was that the labs, both DeepMind, which was now merged with Google Brain and was called Google DeepMind at this point, and also OpenAI, took examples of math problem sets or logic reasoning generated by expert humans and showed the steps of reasoning to the system, and the system would try to replicate them, and it would get sort of points if it replicated it correctly and zeros if it didn't. And through this reinforcement feedback, it learned what reasoning is. And that's when you started in, I guess, the end of 2024, to get models that didn't just spit out an answer instantaneously. They actually ruminated a bit and did some calculations, and they had a scratch pad. You could see their chain of thought, if you wanted to, being outputted on the screen before it gave the final answer. And this catapulted the models to a whole new level of sophistication, but it also catapulted DeepMind, which is good at reinforcement learning, back into the lead. By the end of 2025, Gemini 3 was deemed to be better than the ChatGPT rivals.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you just a couple of final questions, and one of them is just to wonder about your thoughts as to how this race is going to play out in the next few years. In a recent interview that I was able to listen to, both Dario Amodei and Demis Hassabis were making or asked to make prognostications about when superintelligence is going to come. Dario was a little bit more optimistic that it was going to happen before 2030. Demis seemed to be holding on to the 2030 year. But do you see this happening? Do you see another kind of breakthrough that either might happen or might have to happen in order to get to the point where the multiple modalities of intelligence, of calculation, of judgment, of all the different sort of both parts of the brain and elements of what we actually call upon as intelligence would require in order to get to something that might be like superintelligence?
Well, Demis partly says it's going to be 2030 or later because he loves the science so much that he can't bear the idea it's going to end. That's my sort of half-serious joke about his bias on this topic. But he does have a point, which is that there are clear holes in what we have now relative to human capabilities. So, for example, humans can mix short-term planning about what we're going to do in the next half an hour with long-term planning about what we might do next year. And we operate on multiple time frames all the time. It seems that large language models have trouble with that. Humans can read a book and then sort of update all of their understanding, having taken in the knowledge from this book. Whereas a large language model can have the book in its context window, can answer questions about the book, but isn't updating, as it were, its foundation training with the new thing it's just looked at. And so there are lacunae, and Demis would like to address all those. And he thinks for this he needs, another 4 to 6 years or something. And it will take, in his view, more breakthroughs. It will take, something akin to the Transformer paper, maybe 2 of those, before we're really where we want to be. I mean, who knows? I don't think he knows. I don't think anyone of us know how it plays out. But
so last question is to go back to the science. Obviously, in 2024, Demis receives the Nobel Prize. This is for work that goes back to that conversation that he clearly didn't just park away, but then went back to, having to do with protein folding. But he has expressed, and you write about this in the book, an interest in using AI not just for biology, but also for the fundamental questions of physics. The most difficult questions about the nature of the universe, leave alone the questions that have to do with the nature of us as humans. Is he likely to be able to go back at some point to focus primarily on the science? I mean, you end with this kind of tension between being the manager and the entrepreneur on the one side and being the intellectual, the scientist, the inquirer on the other.
Yeah.
But there's a sense that, even though he wants to win and he wants to stay in the game and he wants to run it, and he obviously has a place of great importance in Google, he also wants to figure out the science. So what do you see as a final question for you today?
This is why he is such a fascinating person to have spent more than 30 hours talking to, and why it's been kind of the privilege of my professional career to do that. He is so multifaceted, and he has these two sides. He wants to win. He wants to be in the capitalist competition. He probably might be reluctant to think to himself, were Sundar Pichai to step down, because I think he has a terrific buddy act with Sundar. So as long as the current regime is in place, he's extremely happy with it, because Sundar takes care of the high politics of Google, and Demis does, his leadership of the AI engine, and they need each other, and it's perfect. But if that were to be shaken up, would he be happy with somebody else taking over and it wasn't him? He's very competitive. So can't rule that out. But at the same time, he clearly does feel seriously that it's important to his mental equilibrium to be doing actual science. And he kind of tries to make time between about midnight and 4 a.m. every day to be reading papers. And that's his favorite time of the day. So I honestly don't think he can predict it, and I wouldn't presume to.
Well, I have many more questions, but we've run out of time. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, Sebastian Mallaby. Thanks again for being part of Shaping Science.
Fantastic. I've enjoyed it very much.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIA Sciences.